Hello and welcome to Talk Wildlife, and to this, the second of the safari specials that I'm doing on Kruger Park with Robert from Outlook Safaris. Hi Robert, how are you?
Good, and yourself, Alan?
Very good, thank you. Very good. So first of all, just to clear up one point from the first video, and that will help you both determine the size of the park, but also determine the size of whales. I have figures here that says that Kruger Park is approximately 350 kilometres long by 60 kilometres wide. So that is a huge, vast area. And what we're going to do on this video is we're going to talk about the different camps within the... No, we're not. That's the next one. What we're going to do is... We'll talk about that in the next one, so definitely watch the next one because it's about the camps. On this one, what we're going to do is we're going to talk about making the most of a safari. That's the one we're going to talk about. That it's been a long few days. So what we're going to do is we're going to talk about sort of making the most of safari because, you know, clearly, you know, safaris are not overly cheap. They're not overly expensive as well. And to be honest with you, they're probably the best value for money holiday you're ever going to take. So what we'll do is we'll talk about how to prepare for the safari, what to make sure you do beforehand, and then what you should be doing when you're in the park. And we'll talk about this from 2 points of view when you're in the park. Number one is if you're going with somebody like Outlook Safaris, and number two, if you're self-driving, because I'm sure that there's things Robert can sort of give you tips on around that that will help you make the most of what you paid for. So we start off. What should somebody do, whether they're booking within South Africa or whether they're booking internationally? What's the best way of, first of all, deciding on a safari of you know, what they should be looking at? And then how should they go about prepping that and booking it?
Yeah, thanks, Alan. So I would say there's quite a few things a person needs to look at. You obviously need to consider the time of year that you want to come out, especially because a lot of the visitors come from the northern hemisphere and our seasons obviously being opposite. So you want to know that the time that you come out is a favorable time. Some people enjoy the heat. Other people prefer actually coming when it's cooler, especially because of Africa being known for its hot temperatures. And then you want to be looking at, when you look at the Kruger Park as a whole, is there something specific that you're after? Are you just after a general wildlife experiencing the African bush? Or are you an avid bird lover? Do you want to see the big cats? And then once you have that sort of indication, then start looking at the park itself from the north to the south, which areas will work best for what you want to gain out of your safari.
So just because you mentioned temperatures there, just give us an idea of the variance in temperature from, say, you know, the summer to the winter.
So winter temperatures, a lot of people that already live in the Kruger Park, or what we call the low-veld area of South Africa, will already say that our winters are very mild. And when you compare them to obviously colder places, they are mild. So the winter temperatures, again, depending on where you are in the park, they may drop to 0 degrees at nighttime, but typically you'd be looking at sort of 8, 9, 10 degrees minimum temperatures in the winter, and then those temperatures will climb into the low 20s degrees centigrade. And then in the summer months, that maximum temperature that you would have in the low 20s would become your minimum temperature, and your maximum would climb to the high 30s. The past summer season that we actually had several days in the low 40s. So it can get really hot in the summer months, and that accompanied with high humidity can make it quite uncomfortable for people who are not used to warm temperatures like that.
And what about sort of dry and wet seasons? So when are the dry and wet seasons, and what are the pros and cons of sort of both? You know, clearly, if you've got the dry season, you know, you're going to have more wildlife concentrating around the waterholes, things like that. So what's the pros and cons of the wet and the dry seasons?
Yeah, so up in the northeastern section where you would find the Kruger Park, we have a summer rainfall. So in the summer months, although we get a summer rainfall, that rainfall is often thunder showers in the late afternoon. Sometimes we'll have rain through the night. So you can still have a really good time out on game drives during the day. A lot of people are concerned about too much rain and how that's going to affect their overall experience on game drives. But typically, most of the rain is late afternoons and through the evenings. In the winter months, we don't have any rainfall. When we do, it's really not typical for us to have, and it will normally be a very minimal amount of rain. So in the winter months, a lot of people will say that the best time for game viewing in the Kruger Park is the winter months, because the bush is at its driest then, making viewing a lot easier. But in my personal opinion, the best game viewing is actually the beginning of summer. So through your spring, which would be, in our case, it would be September, October, even November, which can already be quite hot, can be very productive months. Although our winter months would be the driest months, we don't typically get enough rain to make an impact or have a significant impact on the vegetation up until around November. So the bush is continuously drying out right through September, October, and then October means there's very little water out in the bush. So the game numbers start concentrating around any permanent water sources, whether it be rivers or dams. And also when you're driving, the bush is very open. Most of the trees, the vegetation has lost their leaves. There's very little grass cover. So you can see a lot further into the bush, making it easier for game viewing.
Right. And what about, because a lot of people will, concentrate on things like the big five, some will concentrate on birds, some like to see the young animals. So what's the best time of the year for them to come if they want to see, like you've got in the background there, young elephant, or, you know, lion cubs or hyena cubs, or whatever they want to see?
Yeah. So it depends on the species that people are after. Most of the antelope species will have their young to coincide with the first rain so that there's an abundance of food. So anywhere from end of October, I'd say, right through to January, you're going to be seeing young in the bush, and even beyond that. But your bigger animals like your elephant and your rhino, for instance, they are not that dependent on that food source and the rain season. So you could find elephant calves any time of year. Of course, the slower growth of those species also means that you're going to be seeing young elephants for a longer time throughout the year than you would an impala or your smaller antelope that grow at a much faster rate.
Right. Okay, so that's sort of timing of the year. What else should be considered when you're looking, so before you get to the park, what else should you be considering when actually booking the safari? So first, a quick question, malaria. What should people be thinking about with regards to malaria?
Yeah. So the Kruger Park does fall under an area which is considered a high malaria area, a high risk area. But that said, it is always advisable for people to consult a local doctor before they come out. Local guides and people that live in the park and the surrounding areas don't necessarily feel the same way. Mosquitoes, there's certainly areas in the world where mosquitoes are a much bigger problem than they are in the Kruger Park. But nevertheless, it's best to be safe than to be sorry. So most people, we normally recommend, if you're going to be in the park for only a couple of days, you may want to overlook taking malaria. But again, it's a decision that is entirely left up to each person individually. Some people are also concerned about the side effects of the malaria medication. if you plan on being in the park for extended periods, it may be best to then take some prophylactics to ensure your safety.
Right, okay, that's fine. And is there a north-south divide in Kruger where, you know, if you're further south, because we were told if you're further south, then it's not as bad for malaria, and the further north you get, the more likely, or is it just across the park?
It's really right throughout the park. Mozambique, which borders the park, as we mentioned in the earlier episode talk, is a malaria area. So typically your eastern sections of the park, but I mean, mosquitoes aren't confined by any boundaries. So you can find them throughout the park. There isn't necessarily a better area or an area where there's less chance of you getting malaria. It's best to be safe wherever you travel within the park.
Sure. And so what else? What else should we be thinking of if we're going to go on safari before we get there? What else should we be thinking of?
As you've alluded to, you need to think whether you want to travel in a closed vehicle. Do you want to go in an open safari vehicle? Some companies offer you either a closed vehicle or an open vehicle. I think typically people that have some knowledge of safaris enjoy being out, having that open feeling of being on an open vehicle. But sometimes people with small children, families that want to travel to the park, may feel safer being within an enclosed vehicle. Then you can go with a guide, or you can decide to do a self-drive through the park. The park is has a lot of information on the roads and the maps, and the infrastructure is really good. So it is really easy to travel around on your own if you wanted to. Although we always say a guided experience is going to give you a lot more. A guide is there and available to give you information that you would need to research and look up, which you don't always necessarily have the time for. And then besides that, again, depending on the season that you would be coming out to South Africa, you need to consider the type of clothes you bring. Obviously, in the summer months, cooler clothes, sunblock, insect repellents. You want to have a pair of binoculars. You know, although the game sightings can be really good, and a lot of the animals you see are often on the road or close to the road, at times you may see cats off in the distance or whatever animals, and having binoculars is obviously beneficial. Cameras, it just depends on you and the quality of photos you want to take. But nowadays, with people that all travel with their cell phones, you can take photos with your cell phones as well. And I think that is more or less what you'd be looking at before you travel. And then besides that, if there's a particular camp that looks better than the others for your preferences.
Okay, yeah, and what we'll do is we'll cover camps in the next one, hopefully.
Right.
So yeah, we'll cover camps in the next. From my point of view, I highly recommend, and this is purely a personal point of view, but I highly recommend being out in an open Jeep. You know, from my point of view, you then get really engrossed in it. You can smell the Kruger, because the Kruger has a smell to it, and it's fantastic smell. And so you're getting all the smells. You really feel a lot more sort of enveloped in the park, in my opinion, if you're in an open Jeep. And also, you know, again, this is my own personal opinion. I would probably never choose to self-drive. Now, that's not to say that you shouldn't. It's personal preference, and that's because when you go with a guide, they not only know where to look for the things, they know the park, they know the safety, they know the stops, and you know, I've never come across a bad guide. All the guides have been really, really, really good. So yeah, I would personally go with a guide in an open Jeep, and then you can just completely relax in it. It's somebody else's issue as to where they're taking you. You don't have to think about where you're going. You can just enjoy the wildlife. Purely personal opinion. Right, so that's beforehand. We've arrived at the park. So what should you consider? And just one thing that we maybe should mention, because if people are self-driving, is the fees for getting into, not the payment of the holiday, but any fees that there are to get into the park, and also sort of any queuing and stuff like that if they're not in the park, and then how the camps work. So yeah, if we can talk about that a bit first.
Yeah, sure. So once you arrive at the park, depending on obviously whether you've paid for your accommodation up front, which is typically what most people would do, because the park is such a popular destination, you'd want to make sure that you've reserved your accommodation. Once you get to the gate of your preference to go into the park, there is going to be conservation fees and an entrance fee. Now, there is the option of buying, whether you're local or traveling internationally, there is the option to buy what they call a wild card, and you can do that online. And a wild card will oftentimes work out more affordable if you plan on spending an extended time, spending more days in the park. For a shorter stay, it's obviously you would need to work out what's going to be best for you. But over a shorter stay, it's best to then just pay what they refer to as the daily conservation fees. If it's longer, get yourself a wild card. A wild card gives you free entrance to the park for a year, and you can then come in and go out for as many times as you want during that year. Generally, if you're going to be overnighting at camps, they will only be processing or asking you for your wild card once you get to the camp. But at the entrance gate, you're going to have to fill in an entry permit, and you're going to have to give your reservation number so that they can see that you actually have a booking for the park. But the only fees that you're going to be paying is the fees that your entrance fees, and then once you get to the camp, they will process what they call the conservation fees. If those haven't been included in your in the documentation when you pre-booked your safari to the Kruger Park.
Right. Okay. Great. So now we're in the park. How do you make the best of a safari in Kruger Park? What should you be doing? What shouldn't you be doing?
Well, I should also mention, once you enter the park, you get your permit. And on the back of the permit are the basic rules and regulations for the park. I think a lot of people miss out on those, and understanding those are vital to ensuring that you enjoy your experience while you're in the park. Something that a lot of people who have this experience for the first time or come out to the park for the first time don't understand is the danger of being in a wild park the size of the Kruger Park. So a lot of people think they can just get out of their vehicle wherever they are and take a few photos. And while many times you will be safe doing that, you can never tell for sure if there aren't lions close by. And as the park rules state, you're not permitted to leave your vehicle anywhere other than in designated areas where you're clearly given the option to leave your vehicle, and then do so at your own risk. So you need to be aware of those rules. Once you're in the park, stick to the speed limit, and I would even say well below the speed limit. The slower you travel, the more you can see what's going on around you. For me, it's best to have a stop every few kilometers, or a few hundred meters even. Stop your vehicle, switch off the engine, listen to the sounds that are out in the bush. A lot of people drive with their windows closed. This is obviously if you're within an enclosed vehicle. Open your windows. The sights, or let me say the sounds and the smells of the bush are part of what gives you that really good experience of being in the bush. And then what I always say is, the best way to pick up animals that are in the bush is to actually continuously scan from left to right through the bush. So you don't want to be looking at one point continuously or for too long, because then you start convincing yourself the log is a lion or the rock is an elephant. So keep moving, and as you're moving, you should hopefully see some movement which will immediately tell you there's an animal in the bush. And I mean, I suppose people would say, well, that's quite obvious, but be polite. Consider other people that are driving out, and I'm thinking of people that may consider doing self-drives. You don't want to be blocking the road completely. There needs to be people need to be able to move on the road as is necessary. And then if it's your first time and you're doing a self-drive, again, these are reasons why it's best to travel with a guide, because a guide knows, you know, the limitations and the rules. But if you're traveling on your own, you don't want to be taking chances with elephants, big bull elephants, reading signs of elephants that are in musth, that are sexually active, and the aggression levels. You need to know when to avoid certain situations, when you need to move on, or when animals are actually showing you that they're not comfortable with you being in their personal space. So there's quite a lot of considerations. So it's often best to travel with a guide, and you can sit in a vehicle and you can enjoy the bush, you can enjoy the experience, and let the guide do, if you want to call it, the hard work and the thinking.
Yeah, and I mean, I agree with that. And the one thing that you said there, which I think is really important, when we first had the briefing from Outlook, they were talking about, look, we don't move fast. We take our time when we restore. And I think that pays dividends. You know, I think people think that they have to whiz around all over the place looking for the wildlife, but you miss so much by doing that. You know, you've got to take it easy and you've got to take it slowly. So that, I mean, that's really good points for for enjoying the park. And as well as the camps, there's certain, I don't know what they're called, picnic areas and things like that that look to be quite open. I know there's one brilliant one, I can't remember the name of it, but it's where the African Scops owl is. How do I help you?
Off Seoul.
Yeah. That's a fantastic place to stop for a coffee or breakfast or whatever. People might get a bit sort of nervous thinking, well, I'm driving along the park, and if I go into the camp, there's this big fence around it. But if I go into one of these, there's not. How did they know that that is a safe place to stop and, have something to eat?
Yeah, before I answer your question, Alan, I'd also just like to add to the previous point is planning your route is vital. There aren't that many toilet stops in the Kruger Park. So you want to know how long you're planning on going out for, and where are you going to stop and have a leg stretch or a toilet break. Obviously, well, I say obviously, but generally animals prefer moving around in the cooler hours of the day. So you want to be out in the early mornings and the late afternoons. Oftentimes the midday heat is when animals don't move around much, and you may not be as successful with what you see. So you can decide, once you get a map, you can actually decide where you want to go. They have these picnic sites in between camps to be able to give people that opportunity to break up their drives. Those picnic sites, most of the times, you can actually get something to eat or drink there, or you have the option of making yourself something to eat. They are, at this stage still, those picnic sites are completely open to the bush. So animals can freely move into these areas if they wanted to. And there's nothing that is determined that this is a specifically safe spot to create a picnic site. You can actually pick any site you want in the bush and you can create a picnic site. But the movement of people in and out of a site like that normally means animals want to avoid human contact typically. So they stay away. That said, you can get to one of these picnic sites early morning, be the first vehicle there possibly, and you could find an animal or animals within the picnic site because there hasn't been any disturbance. So you always need to be cautious when you're at those picnic sites. Avoid being on the periphery of the picnic sites, because that is where there could be danger, or dangerous situations could be avoided.
Yeah. It's interesting that you should mention the sort of toilet stops and stuff like that and pre-planning, because again, because we would with a guide, I wouldn't have even thought of that because I've never self-driven. But yeah, clearly something that you should take into consideration. Yeah. So carry on.
Yeah, so I think there's a lot to think about, but as is the case with any holiday, you need to do your planning properly beforehand to ensure that your experience is what you are going for.
Yeah, and there's inside the park as well, there's hides. We visited at least 2 that I can remember last time. Are those hides open to sort of general public that are doing self-drive as well as sort of guided tours?
Yes, the hides are open to anybody in the public. Anybody doing game drives are welcome to visit the hides. There are a few scattered throughout the park. Some tend to not attract too much wildlife. Some are really good. And that just, again, you need to do your research. Obviously, if you're with a guide, the guides, if time allows, then they will stop at these hides. It's a really great place for photography if you enjoy photography, and you can spend a good amount of time in these hides just enjoying animals coming and going.
Yeah, and they are brilliant. It's, again, a brilliant experience because there's something about you sort of park up and then you sort of get out of the safety of the Jeep and you're sort of again in their domain. It's the same with the open picnic areas. I mean, I don't know whether it's just me, but it adds that buzz of excitement that you're now completely open to them. You know, you're no longer sort of, even though you might not see anything, you're completely open to the wild. It's a fantastic experience. It really is. I highly recommend all of that stuff. Just one more thing before we move on, and that is, as well as the picnic areas, we bounced between sort of camps as well. So we when we were staying at Skakusa, we went to Lower Sarby for a coffee on the morning. Is that permitted, or is that again just for, you know, people that with guided tours? Can the general public just drive into a camp they're not staying at just for a coffee?
Yes, definitely. So all the camps have a shop, and most of them have restaurants, and so it's there for the public. You do not necessarily have to stay at that camp to make use of the facilities. Most of the camps will also have a separate, what they call a day visitors area, where day visitors, if they chose to maybe prepare some bacon and eggs or something, where you can actually hire a gas bottle and what we call in South Africa skottel. So it's like a pan, and you can do your bacon and eggs on there. You pay the fee for it, and you have someone clean it for you afterwards, which is really convenient. So they have those areas as well. If you decided you'd rather do something on your own than to sit at the restaurant.
Excellent, excellent. Okay, so we've done the camps, we've done the drive. What about waterholes? We visited quite a few waterholes. Waterholes are clearly an area that, you know, will attract wildlife that are coming to drink. So would you recommend that people do spend some time? I know the answer is probably yes, but just for those people that maybe not been on safari before, is it worth spending time, even if when you get there there's nothing there? Is it worth sitting and waiting at a waterhole?
Yes, definitely. I think a lot of times people rush through the park too much in the hope that they're going to bump into something on the road. And while there is a chance of that happening, oftentimes the best experiences you get is when the vehicle is stationary. And so finding a suitable spot to stop at, like a waterhole, or even just at a viewpoint overlooking a river, can be really productive. And again, as we mentioned earlier, depending on the time of year, if the bush is really dry, you're bound to have a very good experience sitting at one of these waterholes and just spending some time there. Not just animal-wise, but birds. A lot of birds come down and enjoy, come for a drink, and that's where you get that real Africa experience, in my opinion.
Excellent, excellent. Right, so I think what we're going to do is, we've been talking about half an hour. The signal's not brilliant, but it's not too bad. What we'll do is we're going to leave it there, because the next one we're going to talk about is the actual camps themselves and sort of where they're positioned in the reserve. So what we'll do is there'll be a few more things that I want to touch on about making the most of the safari, but I think we'll park it and we'll do it, excuse the pun, and we'll do it when we talk about the camps, if that's okay.
Yes, perfect.
Brilliant.
I think that will work great.
Okay, so and if you think of anything in the meantime, when we do the parks one that we might have missed in this one, we'll cover that as well.
100%. Sounds good.
Excellent. All right, Robert, so for now, what we'll do is we'll leave it there and we'll be back to talk about camps, and not just the camps themselves, but where they're positioned in the park, so that you know what type of sort of habitats that you're going to be looking at, and on a few instances, you know, what kind of sort of animals you might expect to see there. The follow-up to that will be about the big five, then about the small five, and then about the 6 birds, and then birds and beyond. So there's plenty to come. So thanks for watching. Thanks, Robert.
Thanks, Allan. See you then.
Bye now.